Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Global Media, Navigating New and Emerging Threats to Press Freedom. My name is Michael Kulma, and I'm the Head of Programs and Communications at International House at the University of Chicago and the Executive Director of One Shared World. This important conversation is being brought to you by International House at the University of Chicago, our sister houses at the University of California, Berkeley and New York City, by One Shared World, and in collaboration with the Chicago Center on Democracy at UChicago. Today's program is part of iHouse Chicago's Global Voices Lecture Series program. Before we jump into the content for today's program, let me share a little bit about International Houses and One Shared World. From the day the first International House in New York opened its doors almost 100 years ago, with Berkeley and then Chicago soon to follow, we've been dedicated to the promotion of understanding and fellowship among the peoples of all nations. Through our programming and communities, we work to promote cross-cultural understanding, mutual respect, and friendship among international students, scholars, and the broader global community. That mission is made manifest through programs like today's, and that mission guides the work of the 13 other international houses around the world. While One Shared World is 96 years younger than the oldest of the international houses, its mission is in fundamental alignment with iHouses. One Shared World was founded in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic as a community of hundreds of people around the world coming together to address the mismatch between the global challenges we face and the predominantly national way we are organized to address them. These challenges are broader than deadly pathogens. They include climate change, ecosystem destruction, weapons of mass destruction, and global underdevelopment. The virus made it clear that we are all interdependent. Each person's security and well-being resides in every other person and in our common ecosystem, and we must work together and help each other. That help is not charity. It's one of the best investments we can make in helping ourselves. To learn more about the work of the iHouses, One Shared World, and the Chicago Center on Democracy, please check out their websites that you'll find scrolling on screen and dropped into the chat. Now to our program. As we gather here today, the global dialogue on freedom of expression and freedom of the press are very front and center topics. News stories are everywhere in the United States about freedom of expression on college campuses. But more broadly, 2024 is on track to be one of the biggest global election years in history. That at a time when independent media is under attack. So how do global news organizations build trust among audiences in a world awash with propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation? How do they circumvent censorship to reach people in restrictive media environments? And how do they protect journalists who are targeted for simply doing their jobs? Answering those questions are the task at hand today. And we are incredibly lucky to have with us today someone who has been at the forefront of that conversation for many years, Amanda Bennett. Ms. Bennett is the CEO of the U.S. Agency for Global Media and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, investigative journalist, and editor. She was named Director of Voice of America in March 2016, serving until June 2020. Previously, she was the executive editor of Bloomberg News, where she created and ran a global team of investigative reporters and editors. She was the editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, editor of the Herald Leader in Lexington, Kentucky, and a managing editor at the Oregonian in Portland, Oregon. Ms. Bennett served as a Wall Street Journal reporter for 23 years, including stints in Toronto and Beijing, and she has also been a contributing columnist for the Washington Post. Ms. Bennett will be in conversation today with Dr. Layla Brammer and Pedro Hewitt-Lopez. Dr. Brammer is the Director of Outreach and Instructional Development at the Parisi Program for Public Disclosure at the University of Chicago. As the inaugural Director of Chicago's Parisi Program for Public Discourse, she develops curricula, programming, and outreach to advance the Chicago principles of freedom of expression and foster the capacity for vigorous, inclusive, and productive discourse in the classroom, campus, and civic life. Pedro is currently a candidate for a master's degree in public policy from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. At Harris, Pedro has delved into research regarding economic theory, inclusive development, and how freedom of press and democracy intertwine. Pedro is also an International House Graduate Fellow at the university. And a little advance congrats to Pedro, our Norder, as he'll be graduating in just a few weeks. Following their conversation, Layla and Pedro will ask Ms. Bennett questions from the audience, so please feel free to drop your questions in the chat throughout the program. With thanks again to our sister houses in Berkeley, thank you, Nayeli, and in New York City, thank you, Anthony, to One Share World, to the Chicago Center of Democracy, and especially to Ms. Bennett and her team, Layla and Pedro. Let me now turn the floor over to Layla and Pedro to get the conversation going. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We're really glad to start, and we have quite a list of questions. And our first one, and one to start the conversation, now that we have Amanda on screen, is seeing that Amanda has had an incredible career, a Harvard College graduate, Pulitzer Prize winner, just a marvelous career. One of the things what we wanted to actually know is what drove you towards a career preserving press of freedom above all else that you've accomplished?
You know, I didn't join Voice of America until 2016, so relatively late in my career. And one of the things I began to say almost immediately after joining is I realized joining Voice of America that I actually did believe all the things that I said I had believed for my entire career, which is how important journalism is in preserving democracy. So watching the people who are working in these very oppressive environments to do the things that I was able to do perfectly freely throughout my entire life made me realize that this is just as important, and maybe even more so than I thought for my entire career.
Amanda, thank you again for being with us. Can you tell us a little bit about the work of the U.S. Agency for Global Media?
Sure. The agency isn't really a household name, but many of the pieces of the agency are. As you mentioned, I was the director of Voice of America, which is the big federal portion of it, and that broadcasts around the world. But there's also a number of other organizations: Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcasting, Office of Cuba Broadcasting, and an organization I think we'll talk about later, which is called the Open Technology Fund, that helps develop circumvention tools that enable us to get into closed environments. And then our very, very latest organization, which is called it's a new name, the Global News Service. I'm sorry, we were going back and forth about different names, and it's basically going to be a news service that's going to go around the world, starting with Mandarin and English, developing news for China for users around the world.
It's fantastic what a big portfolio you have protecting journalism, getting information out around the world. I'm going to take us back and get a little bit of context, and you may not agree with me, but I remember this moment in the 90s where we had this incredible promise about free expression and freedom of expression with this expanding democratic moment throughout the world. So, you know, now looking 30 years back, how did we get where we are? And maybe where are we and how do we get there?
You know, one of the things that I keep reminding people of is that Voice of America was created in 1942, and it was created, and its first broadcasts were in German. And the purpose was to get information behind Nazi lines about what was actually going on in the war, because people in Germany had no other option for finding that out. And then later on in the Cold War, I'll give you another example, which is Albania. You know, we broadcast the news from around the world into Albania for years and years and years without knowing whether a single person was hearing it. We did not know until Albania opened up many, many years later that it turned out that 90% of the people in the country were listening, despite the fact that it was illegal to do so. So when you think about these ebbs and flows of things, our organization has been at the forefront of both. It's been at the forefront of, you know, the flowering of democratic free expression, and then also at the closing of markets. And so we tell ourselves right now that this is a difficult period and probably becoming more difficult, but it's what we were built to do. This is what we were intended to do, is to get free, believable, credible, truthful news and information into places that have no other access to it. So whether it's in an open time when things are flowering, or closed times when things are shutting down, that's what we're here for.
Marvelous. Thank you so much, Ms. Bennett. One of the questions we also had, seeing that you've done work globally, and it's quite fascinating, is 2024 is quite a year, right? There's a ton of elections. Just to name a few, there's Uruguay general elections, my own country, Mexico's general elections. There's also going to be local elections in Poland, and not to mention the States. So one of the questions is, when you're working on a year that's so crowded with so many things going on in different places, and even in places, far away like India, what are the largest issues you're working on usually?
So the largest, it really basically just comes down to exactly the same thing. In many of the countries that you are just referenced, we really are the only way that the people in that country will know a great deal about what's going on in their own country. And for those of you, I'm sure many of you come from or have visited or lived in these other countries, in places where you are in a society where the information is coming filtered through either a government or an oligarch source, and then you put it beside a more free, independent source of news, you can feel the difference. You can see what the difference is, and that our audiences tell us that, the audiences see that, and they trust us. So that's what we make sure we do, is we make sure that whatever is going on, whether it's an election, whether it's a coup, whether it's social unrest, that we are the source they can turn to and trust what we're doing, and trust the information that they're hearing, and they can contrast it with what they're seeing and hearing from their own governments.
Okay, so in that sense, it's similar, let's say, in different contexts, be it India, be it Mexico, be it United States.
That's correct. And by the way, we only broadcast. We do not broadcast into the United States. We never have from the beginning of our operation. It's in fact illegal for us to broadcast into the United States for a whole variety of reasons. I think you can understand. We don't want a government-funded organization broadcasting into our own country. We are bringing news and information into places where people don't have access to it, and we at this point still have ample access to it. So we don't do that. We also don't broadcast into other international countries where there has been traditionally a free press. Now, we evaluate this continuously. We don't broadcast into India, for example, because for the longest time, India was considered to have a free press. We may have to reconsider that down the road at some point. So we're only, our whole entire mission is to broadcast into places that don't have any other access to truthful, free information and to a free press.
Perfect.
Amanda, can you talk a little bit about that process by which you do that? You talked about India, which has had a crackdown on freedom of the press. I think they're the second leading government for arrests of journalists at the moment, or certainly in the top 5. There's Turkey, there's Mexico. I mean, I could keep going with the list. How do you evaluate which countries are ones that you're going to be working with or in? What are the challenges then of getting the information to the people?
Sure. There's a fairly complicated and fairly rigorous process of looking at the places we broadcast, and they involve a lot of research, a lot of evaluation of what's going on, and then we kind of have to tier who we're speaking towards, because we obviously can't broadcast everywhere. We have to be selective about where we go. And so we have a list of places that every year we evaluate to see whether we need to add them, or in some cases, drop them off, because hopefully they've established a relatively free environment of their own. We have done that in the past, and hopefully we'll be able to do more of it in the future. Hopefully we'll be able to drop more people and add. But honestly, we're looking at expanding in a number of different areas.
Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like for a citizen on the ground? How would I hear about where to find you, and how would I then access the information that you're providing?
So we say that we broadcast, and broadcast is, I think we should probably use a different word, but broadcast in whatever technologies the people in that country are receiving their information. And so that means we do everything from, we still have shortwave because there's certain parts of the world where shortwave is, like North Korea, for example, where shortwave is the only way of accessing people with our information, all the way up to digital content, including things that are created for the instant messaging apps that we do. So we're using every form of communication that we can. So people in those countries will find us where they find their other operations. We have apps that people can find. We often broadcast in places where we're able to do that through local media partners. So, for example, in a good part of South and Latin America, we are basically news partners with existing media stations. And for example, we've developed a really good process where the Voice of America is basically their Washington bureau for a large number of commercial media stations in Latin and South American countries, where they call up every morning and say, this press conference, this hearing, could you deliver us this thing? And they get delivered on request. And then the other organizations like Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia do the same thing. They broadcast in places in ways that their audiences receive information. And for example, Radio Free Asia, which largely broadcasts into China and other very, very repressive environments, they have to be much more creative and deliberate about the way they get their information to people.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda. One of the questions we had precisely is, we're in the third decade of the 21st century, and we started with a pretty, let's say, fast start. We had a international pandemic. Currently, there's global international conflicts, and one of the questions that we had, and when thinking about this, is, okay, in your experience and in your work, is there evidence that these massive events and let's say critical junctures in worldwide and globally, have they affected press freedom in any way? Have they in some way increased the ability of journalists to report? Have they has these events generated barriers to what journalists can say? What has been your experience based on these past few years with these massive incidents?
So let me see if I can answer this a little bit different way, which is, what we find is that when there are crises, either local crises or global crises, we find that that's where people come to us. And so, for example, during the COVID epidemic, we saw our audience in China and around China increased dramatically, particularly when there were things like the COVID protests inside China. You'd see because with our digital audience, we can see in real time what's happening. So you can see the audience spiking when things like that are happening. And there's crises around the world, but there's also local crises that are very important in these countries. So for example, I'm sure you all remember the really upheaval in Iran when Mahsa Amini, the young woman who was arrested for wearing her headscarf wrong, was killed in prison, and there were kind of widespread protests inside Iran. During that period, we saw our audience just grow dramatically, including especially among people who were using our circumvention tools to get outside their own closed media environment and find our content. And so at that point, just to underscore that this is not a trivial thing, we found that something between 20 and 25% of all Iranian adults were accessing our content during that period using our circumvention tools. And when you consider that CNN has CNN, Fox both have about a 20-25% market share in the United States, completely free. That's the same number of Iranians that were finding their way to our information. So, and we find that over and over again. We find it when something is happening, when there's a shutdown in Cuba, for example. We find that people, even though it's illegal to reach us, try aggressively to find us, and that's one of the things we see as kind of our value, is when there's something major going on in the world and people don't trust what their own governments are telling them, they come to us.
Remarkable. And about that, just in that sense, it makes sense that, when there's a local or global crisis, people try to reach out. But usually, do you also notice that throughout time, like in places, let's say, in which there hasn't been as many, crises or like these junctural events, do you see like an uptick usually in people trying to connect you throughout time, like, throughout, even if it's peaceful and things haven't gone like really, haywire or things? Have you guys seen like an increase over time? Like, okay, our message is working, like people are starting to believe us in the country. Have you seen something around those lines?
So let me see if I can understand your question. So we do have a fairly sophisticated and robust way of analyzing our impact inside countries, and those have to do both with our audience, and our audience has risen quite substantially over time, including this recent year. But we also look at things that have to do with what we consider to be our impact. So, for example, when the heads of our organizations like Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia are called out by a government that says this person's an enemy of our country, we consider that means that they're thinking about us, they're paying attention to us. And when North Korea says that we are spreading lies, we consider that means they're paying attention to it. When during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were finding that people were posting little QR codes on telephone posts and trees and things like that, and the QR code said that they were going to an IKEA sale, only it wasn't. It was a means of connecting with Radio Free Europe. It was, so when you got the QR code, you could find your way to Radio Free Europe without alerting the authorities that you were going there. So we do find that that's an evidence to us that there is impact to what we're doing. We don't seek deliberately to have any particular impact in a country. That's not our job. We don't say, oh, we want this government to fall, or we want this result in the election or anything. We just want to make sure, and I think it's one of the key things about why we are so trusted, is that we simply provide the believable, credible information with a full perspective of views, and let the people decide for themselves. I think that once you decide that you're trying to gain some particular outcome, all of a sudden your news becomes less credible. And so I think people understand that we are the one value that we're trying to push. And I say that we export the First Amendment. It's the one value we're trying to push, which is freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and freedom of information. That's the only thing that we are trying to make sure that people have when they reach us.
Incredible, Amanda.
Amanda, can you talk about some of the tensions and pressures in that with different administrations? Because certainly you work under the US government, and the executive branch may have an idea about whether they want which candidate they want in an election, or whether they want a certain leader to fail or fall. How do you navigate the type of tensions that might exist in what the administration wants and you working in the executive branch?
So we don't actually work in the executive branch. We're completely federally funded via the U.S. Congress, but we also, from the very beginning of our organization, has been independent. We've had periods when we were back closer to the foundation, where we were closer to the State Department, but our whole goal was to be independent of any kind of outside control. I think you've heard about Edward R. Murrow, who was one of the godfathers of the organization, and the first thing that was said during our first broadcast is, the news may be good for America, or the news may be bad for America, but either way, we'll tell you the truth. And that's been our founding motto from the beginning. And so we are very clearly separate from the messaging operations that perhaps other parts of the U.S. government want to do, but that's not our role. And I think we find that role is very, very, very respected, I think, throughout the U.S. government.
And a follow-up on that, Amanda, with the U.S. elections coming up, how, it's hard enough here as an American citizen to sort through the news and figure out what is happening, right? How do you decide how you're going to share that information out to other countries?
So let me just tell you a little bit about the way our operation looks. I mean, we've got a big building in Washington that's got satellites on the roof and TV studios in the basement, radio studios all around. And in Prague, we have another similar building that contains all the same things that's in the European sphere. Radio Free Asia has all kinds of digital operations to get them to places. We have local journalists who are in these countries, and in each one of our organizations, we have separate newsrooms. So we have 63 separate newsrooms in 63 separate languages that are run by people who are natives of those countries, who are native speakers of those languages, and are very much in touch with the needs and wants of their organizations. So we are taking our cue from what the countries are looking for. So one of our mandates is to basically cover the local situation in their countries, but it's also to make sure that news about the United States in a neutral and fair way gets brought out to those countries. And so it's not like there's a central thing that says, okay, here's Amanda Bennett. Today you're going to do this. Today you're going to do. It's not like that at all. It's like any other news organization where the news decisions are made by the local editors in response to what their audiences are looking for. It's really cool.
It is really cool.
It is very cool.
Clearly, we know that the work you do is, it has high impact. There's a lot of stakeholders involved in every basically transmission, especially when you're talking about a different country. In that sense, one of the things we were also wondering about is if you're an organization, like when you're, spreading this information or giving this information to the population, have you experienced any type of pushback, or how does that pushback materialize? Is it just some critiques, or is it something a bit more generalized?
No, this is a very, very serious issue. We are going into a period that I think is very, very, very hazardous for our journalists around the world. And I mean, right now, I'm sure you've heard of Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who's in prison in Russia. Radio Free Europe has a journalist who is also imprisoned in Russia. Her name is Alsu Kurmashiva, and she is a member of the Radio Free Europe staff. She's been in jail just about half as long as Evan. She's been held under deplorable conditions, and she's being held simply as a journalist. And we are finding that is more and more what we are afraid we are going to be facing. We have, a whole bunch of journalists, and mostly our stringers, our local stringers who are operating in local environments, who have been imprisoned either for their relating to work that they've done with us or relating to other free press work that they've done. The situation facing journalists around the world is increasingly hazardous. And so one of the things that we've been doing, particularly very recently, is we've really been increasing our efforts to understand and build up our capacity to protect journalists when they're going into dangerous situations. And dangerous might mean going into war zones like in Ukraine, or it may be going into countries where they risk arrest. And we're also trying to work much harder, as are basically most journalistic organizations around the world that have, people in these dangerous environments. We need to also figure out how we better support these journalists when they do find themselves in trouble. I mean, during the Russian invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Radio Free Europe wound up having to extract, dozens and dozens of journalists out of Russia because it was too dangerous to be there. So now we have a lot of journalists who are living and working as expatriates now, and we're finding that as a situation that we're increasingly facing. So it's very, very difficult, likely get more difficult. And just to show you the kind of passion we have, one of the things that all news organizations are finding is they're trying to get more rigorous about not allowing journalists to go into places. It's not that we say go in and take your chances. It's more that when there's a big crisis, we find that more people raise their hands to get close to the action than really should. And so, for example, just during the recent Israel-Gaza situation, we had just phenomenal numbers of people that wanted to go in and cover that, and we had to at least start out and say, we're only going to accept people who have had previous combat coverage. You can't go in unless you've had a really rigorous set of coverage. You can't just go running in there and say, I'm just going to take my chances. So we're having to really, really make sure that we prepare people ahead of time, that they have protective equipment if there's physically dangerous things, that they have proper understanding of what they should do if they're in terrible situations, that they're prepared for the idea that they might be taken in some way, either by groups, extremist groups. We've seen that thing happening around, for the last 20 years, but we're starting to see more of that, or increasingly by governments themselves.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I just wanted to ask, aside from which is this situation in which you're protecting journalism, when governments, or other authorities call you liars, and your organization, they call you, you're not covering correctly, what other difficulties does that cause, or how do you react, or how do you plan against these strategies?
So one of the things that we just had happen to us just recently is we were I forget what the exact thing was, but we were told not to cover a certain thing, and we said sorry about that, and so the African government took us off the air, and they said it was going to be for a brief period of time, and we thought maybe it was going to be for a long period of time, but so we took them seriously about the brief period of time. We took off the air for the 2 weeks, and we just went back on. We've been back on for a couple of days, and so we're testing the waters there. But we find that there's places where we were previously operating rather freely, like in Turkey, both Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, and by the way, other international, government-sponsored free press organizations like BBC and Deutsche Welle, the German analog to Voice of America. We were operating relatively freely, and then over the last 5-6 years, it got tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And so recently there's been government regulations that say that we have to sign on to a certain government protocol that essentially says we won't report or broadcast anything the government doesn't approve of. So we're not going to do that. So we find that we have to figure out ways to alter the way we work within these countries. And a lot of it, gets back to the whole question of circumvention, because as we increasingly find it may be more difficult for the people inside those countries to work, we have to figure out how we get more effective about working from the outside in.
Thank you. Amanda, we have a question from the audience that was a question that we were going to ask as well, but how do you, in today's world where we have misinformation, a distrust in media, now we have generative AI that can look very much like real news. How do you generate trust among an audience? And maybe that's, for your agency, but also just broadly as journalists.
Let me back into that question by saying a kind of an unbelievable statistic. Basically, in the places where we can measure trust, there's some places like North Korea where we can't, but we have about a 70% trust rating from our audiences around the world. And considering that American media inside the United States probably has something a little south of 10%, you find that people who are living in places that legitimately have no other access than a government-controlled, media, recognize the value and believe what we are telling them, because we are going out of our way to make sure we're not pushing any particular line. So generating trust has to do with giving people news and information that they find credible and believable. And so it's not a trick. I mean, there's no particular trick to doing it. It's continuing to do all of that. And I mean, I think the trust numbers that we have to all our organizations, all of our organizations, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, they all have very, very high trust numbers in their related countries.
About that, one of the questions that we were also wondering is what methodologies, or like what is your approach to kind of like figure out when you see an image, when you get some type of leads or even information that is in fact, not misinformation, not an attempt to distort. Like what's kind of like the process you guys use to find that?
Sure. Like most news organizations, we are working very, very hard to validate news and information. And by the way, each one of our media organizations inside the USH Global Media has some form of a fact-checking operation. There's one that's in the Middle East Broadcasting Organization that's called "Did It Really Happen?" There's a Radio Free Asia has a fact-check lab. Office of Cuba Broadcasting partners with local fact-checking operations, and so we have one at Voice of America that's called Polygraph, and it does a lot of it basically fact checks and gives out the information about that. But at the same time, there's also things that you have to do to make sure that your own information is credible and factual. And so, for example, in a lot of countries where we're not actually physically present, we depend on audience uploaded content, and we're very, very rigorous about making sure that we evaluate the content, make sure it's genuine, make sure it's coming from places. And you've seen this in other news organizations around the world. There's actually, kind of really interesting techniques right now that still work right now. The bad technology is obviously going to keep one step ahead of it, keep moving, but to evaluate photos and see whether they've been manipulated, look and see whether they're coming from where they are. And you find that, over and over again, we find such really interesting things like, images of, kind of riots in certain countries that show people climbing over a wall. And when we do the evaluation of the photos, it turns out it was something that was taken, decades ago or years ago from a completely different country. And it wasn't really what they said it was at all. And putting out that information, I think, does help us get to the trust, because we're checking to make sure we're not putting out anything that's not accurate, and we're also fact checking what we're seeing that the other governments are saying. So we think that's a really interesting part of what we're doing, and the whole organization, and not just the whole organization, but all of these international broadcasters that are working in these kind of malign environments, we're trying to find ways of getting ahead of this. I just had a super interesting call with a big group who's working really hard at, my non-technical way of looking at it is it's like watermarking our content so that we're not trying to depend simply on making sure that we look at their content. We want to make sure that when we put ours out, and by the way, this is still very theoretical, that we have some kind of a watermark in it, so somebody out there looks at, you'd be able to look at, and you'd be able to see that it was authentic because it's got some indelible thing that can't be manipulated. It's a really interesting way that people are looking at how to do this. And by the way, it's not just a problem with media. You find that companies, global companies, are saying the same thing. They want to make sure that the communications they put into those countries, that their advertisements, that the things that are all left alone, or that they have ways of proving it really came from them. I think that's a really interesting next step that's people are working on right now, is not just fact check stuff that's coming, but make sure we guarantee what's going out.
Wonderful.
Amanda, I was going to ask you that question about whether anyone had tried to fake being your voice. So had people created fake news stories that looked like your news stories and were trying to circumvent what you were doing or push their own messages?
Yeah, there have been these things, but luckily up until this point, the things that come into your email box saying, you've just had a delivery from the U.S. Post Office. Please click here, and we'll tell you. You can look at those things, and that I mean, people do fall for them, but on the other hand, they're pretty obvious. And so far, knock on wood, most of the attempts that we've seen like that to fake or duplicate our content are pretty crude. So, I mean, we're certainly not going to depend on that being the case for the next 10 years. But on the other hand, we're trying to keep ahead of it.
Yeah, one of the things that I also wanted to ask is on this sense, like when you're working precisely on, checking the information and the data, the images, do you think that there needs to be is there more the skills used? Is there programming skills, or there individuals that have different types of skills, like analyzing the sources of kind of where the image is coming, or what are the skills needed to analyze the evidence?
All of those things. And since I'm not technologically minded myself, I'd be embarrassing myself if I tried to tell you specifically what kind of skill sets they are. But we are finding that more and more journalists are finding that this is part of their toolkit, and either they come into the organization with some pretty good skill in that, or a lot of people are developing it, and on the job training, they're figuring this stuff out themselves. Plus, there is I think a very robust connection among all the different news organizations that try and do this work, where we're very actively engaged in sharing. The global organizations that are similar to ours are BBC World Service, Deutsche Welle, which is the German service. There's France Médias Monde, which is French. There's one in Japan. There's one in Canada. There's one in Australia. So all these organizations band together, and we spend a lot of time comparing notes and trying to help each other out, because, as I like to say, there's more of the bad guys than the good guys. So the good guys have to stick together.
Thank you so much for that. Well, right now, one of the parts that we're going to move right now with is audience questions. There's been a ton of audience questions that they've been making, and we're quite interested about the chat. One of them here says, "It's great to hear that most of the target audiences receive the news you broadcast. I'm wondering if subsidizing VPNs is a viable means of increasing media access, since these tend to be expensive."
That's a really great question. I can answer that by telling you about a crisis we had for exactly that reason. During that Masih Amina moment that we were talking about, we wound up with such demand for our content because we not only develop the circumvention tools, we also support them. And even though it's something like, I think, 7 cents a year per user to do that, we've wound up that the demand was so high that it was coming close to threatening to use up the entire budget of the Open Technology Fund, which is the part of the organization that does that. So we were finding literally that we couldn't afford to support all of that. So that's a really good question. And so making sure that we make these things as cost effective as we possibly can, but also recognizing that reaching audience members at like 7 cents per year, that's amazing. There's nothing that compares with that. So it is expensive, but relatively, when you think about it, it's relatively expensive, but is it worth it? I think that providing that access to outside news and information to people that are clearly desperate for it, since they're coming out of closed environments, despite the fact that it's illegal for them to do so and could possibly, expose them to severe penalties, we think that that's really worthwhile. All of this is expensive. It's expensive to do shortwave. Shortwave is probably one of the most expensive means of communication out there. So everything costs something, and this we feel like is a pretty reasonable cost for a pretty big impact.
Wonderful.
Amanda, we have another audience question. I'm going to read it for you. Your observation about statistics sounds like you have information that, in effect, constitutes a poll that could be very useful to us in our work in public policy and world problems. Is there a way that students and others studying this could access some of the information you have?
You know what? You've caught me here because I don't know what we can and can't share. I mean, obviously, a lot of our stuff is completely available to everybody. If whoever asked the question can find a way to contact me directly, I'll make sure we put them in touch with whoever the people in our research department, and they can help us figure out what we can and can't share. But literally, if there's things that we can share, we certainly will.
Incredible. And here, another question from the audience said, did you see a decline in trust around the world to the news you were pushing out during any presidency, during any crisis, despite, the situation worldwide? Like, did the COVID pandemic, did one of these situations or any event kind of like decrease generalized in the globe, the trust in media, or is it just something regional per country?
I watched our numbers throughout all of those periods, and I have to say it's almost, I feel like it's almost the opposite, which is that the more fraught things were, the more people were looking for something they could trust. And again, we kind of track crises around the world and try and look and see what people are consuming of ours. And so we definitely, I think, found that some of these crises did lead to an increase in audience. And literally, I mean, we've been watching our audience growth overall, and it hasn't slowed down. So our audience growth kept moving up really quite substantially during all these periods. So if there was a decline in trust because of that, people were expressing it in a rather odd way, by coming to find more of us. So, that's all I can basically say is we don't observe any fall off in audience. And you would think if people didn't trust us or didn't believe us, then our audiences would fall off. And in fact, it's quite the opposite.
Amanda, go ahead, Pedro.
No, then I think that it's a bit what Layla wants to go for, but basically that kind of tells us optimism, right? That somewhere or another, even in a world in which there's disinformation, there's kind of like a trend of people kind of looking for the things you're doing.
Yeah, listen, let me be perfectly clear. We're in a terrible position right now, and it is likely to get worse. We have all acknowledged inside all our various organizations that it's not going to get better anytime soon. It's very likely to get a lot worse. You see that we are broadcasting into authoritarian countries, and the trend toward authoritarianism is increasing. But that optimism says to me that we still see people who are looking to find information outside these closed systems. And again, I go back to our history, and during periods like even during World War II, when you look at the technological means of transmission that were available to people then, I think that we were just as much shut out from various countries and risk in various countries as we are today, and maybe more so, because we now have greater technological ability to try and get around this stuff. So, I think this optimism among pessimism, maybe we don't think our work is going to get any easier. What with the ability to close off societies, for example, I mean, we've seen that China has just about managed to close off its access into its entire country, and it's exporting those technologies to other countries around the world. So we're going to expect to see that increasing over the next years or decades. So no, it's not a rosy situation, but we don't feel that the demand for what we're providing is being affected in a way other than we think to increase around the world.
Amanda, it is, in today's news of declining trust in the media and also declining people actually reading or accessing real media, it is remarkable that you have a growing audience and no one has a 70% trust rating. So talk to us a little bit about, what advice would you give to others about how you've been able to make that happen?
And this is going to go back to your original question about how I came to do this work. I've had a long journalistic career back to a point where I think we were much more rigorous about keeping ourselves out of the story, that the story was about the news, it was about the audience, it wasn't about our personal views. I think we were much more rigorous about holding ourselves to standards to make sure that we didn't just sort people into buckets and have say this is doing this is doing this and just make it a fight. We were trying to find out more about what the underlying issues were and what people really thought, and we didn't just label it. So I believe that there was a much more rigorous attempt to try and be neutral and informative than there is now. And some of that obviously you can't complain too much about, because as you've seen, the staffing has gone down at news organizations around the world, meaning that things have to be done more quickly and without quite as much rigor. But on the other hand, I've been very clear, and our organization has the advantage of the fact this is really in our mission, is to say, there's journalism and there's activism, and both of them are really, really wonderful things that are necessary in the world to make social change. There are two different ways of making social change. So if you want to be an activist, go be an activist. That's great. But if you want to be a journalist, there's a whole different standard of the way you do things, and you want to do things that mean that you are open-minded to making sure that you present things as factually as you possibly can, and that you present things in ways, even if the outcome is things you don't feel so comfortable about. That's kind of part of your job as a journalist. And since our organizations really have, from their very beginning, the news may be good for us, news may be bad for us, but we'll tell you the truth. That's really part of our DNA. And so I think it's one of the things that makes it easier for us to, I think, proceed in a way that cause people to have trust in us.
Wonderful. One of the audience questions that just came through is basically, it says that basically your office is important for your office to be seen as independent and non-partisan, and you're not part of the executive office, clearly. That said, your work could have an impact on the overall nature of a relationship, for example, the US-China relationship, a relationship that is already fraught and there's kind of tension in it. How do you balance the need to share the news with the potential impact it might have on important US bilateral relations?
Remember earlier in this conversation, I said that we don't aim for any particular specific social, political action or result. We feel that the basic value of access to believable, trusted, true information is a global benefit, that it is a benefit in and of itself. And so we don't step back and say, well, if we say this, it might affect the bilateral relations. That almost puts us back into a situation that would be the kind of information we're trying to keep away from doing. That's what the other governments are doing. They say, we want you to do this because we want to have the specific outcome. In those authoritarian countries, they're saying, we want you to think about it this way. That's not the way we think at all. We think, okay, what happened here? What is really happening? What did this person actually say? And by the way, when we're talking about these kinds of things, even, for example, the reporting what our leaders of our countries are saying in regards to those other countries, sometimes that's a really radical thing, because we're the only ways that people can even find out what is being said. Like for example, at the Middle East Broadcasting Network, which broadcasts exclusively in Arabic, they're basically the only source of any information whatsoever about any U.S. involvement in the whole region at all. So it isn't like we have to kind of pussyfoot around things. We're just saying, okay, here's what's happening. And we don't think that that's a bad thing at all. We're not deliberately going out to sabotage anybody's bilateral relations. But if it's true and it's factual and it's happening, we feel like that's something we should be assisting people around the world to find out about, wherever they are.
Wonderful.
We have a related audience question. How are you able to measure the tangible impact of your work? And maybe also, what are the metrics by which you measure your impact? And how can the general public aid in your mission?
So those are two separate and really, really interesting questions. And so I spoke briefly earlier about what we call our impact model. And that impact model is a a construct that was built that we're basically trying to follow really rigorous research protocols for, that kind of looks at not only our audience, but the growth in our audience, the people that we know are consuming it, but also then again, kind of measuring from afar the kind of non-statistical, but nonetheless kind of, we think, interesting and dispositive things that you find out, like when as happened recently. I think one of the heads of our organization's Radio Free Europe was ticking off all the people all the countries he's been condemned in. I forget what it is. It's like an undesirable person, and so if they feel necessary to call the heads of organizations undesirable, it certainly means that they have some issue with what we're doing. So it's a kind of a little mishmash of very straightforward, survey information, and we do surveys just like any. We use Gallup polls in countries where we can use Gallup polls. We do in-person polling in countries where it's possible, and we do online polling in places where it's not. So it's a whole combination of statistics and research, but also kind of non-specific, but things that feel like they're really meaningful. And so we put it all together and try and use it to evaluate our impact. And how can the general public help? I tell you what, I told you earlier that we're forbidden by law from broadcasting inside the United States, which I think is a good thing, but it does mean that we are not as well known, and people inside the United States do not realize the unbelievable impact and the unbelievable value we bring to the world for this country. And I want people to understand and value what we do, partly because it affects our budgets, and partly because we want people to feel proud of the values that we have as Americans, particularly the value of a free press. And so the way people can help with this is basically, I'm glad you're all here listening to us. That's one thing, but I would really like it if more and more and more people were to realize just what an amazing asset we have here, and how many people are really devoting, risking all kinds of danger to get this information to people around the world.
That's incredible, Amanda. Thank you so much. One of the questions the audience also had is, could you elaborate on exactly what does it mean when you say that the U.S. Agency for Global Media is independent? Like, what does it entail?
So it means that, and interestingly enough, I'm now, as the CEO of the organization, I'm kind of on the other side of the independence. So I don't go. I supervise, I oversee, I help make sure that everything is working well, but I don't go into Office of Cuba Broadcasting or to the Radio Free Asia and say, I didn't like that story about this. I really think that you ought to have been harder on China because of this. Change it for me. We don't, outside influences don't, it's completely done by the journalists according to journalistic principles, and people from the outside. And because I'm the head of the agency, I'm kind of on the outside of the journalism, and I'm trying to model that. Even though I myself have spent 40 years as a journalist, I do not go in and direct what the coverage is going to look like. The only way in which I have influence over the coverage look like is I am responsible for making sure that our content is the highest standards of professional journalism. And so I will look at metrics that show, are we fulfilling our mission or not? And if not, I will help try and figure out ways that we can do that. But I don't go in and say, I don't like that story, or that story didn't match my political views. And we don't allow other people from the outside to do that either. And honestly, I've been an editor at a ton of news organizations around the country, and I have to say that I haven't seen any greater attempt to breach that independence than I have at the metro newspapers I've worked in, where you get calls from the community all the time saying, that was, fix that thing, just change it, and so we still have to push back against all that. So I don't find it that significantly different.
Amanda, we have another question that is not unrelated. The question asker says, I've always been curious about the concept of reporting all sides of the story versus a false balance. Could you please share your thoughts on this?
I'm glad you asked that question, because honestly, I think that idea of a false balance is a kind of a trick that was played on us, that they became a kind of a way not to have to think about this issue. A false balance is if you say, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about evaluating what you're hearing and seeing and making sure that you are including the perspectives of those people. And that's not a false balance. If you're saying this group, this organization, this part of the country, this part of the people are feeling this, that is a fact. You may not like that fact, but just because you don't like that fact doesn't mean that you don't report that fact, because it might seem to be a false balance. You make by saying a false balance, I feel like that we're really significantly undervaluing and in some ways being disrespectful for the hard work and reporting and evaluating and thinking that we expect our journalists to do, and sort of act like they're just transcribing and saying here. That's not the way it works at all. We expect people to evaluate the situations, make sure you represent them. Representing them does not necessarily mean supporting them. And so I'm glad you asked that question, because I really do think that's a kind of an important thing to think about when you're thinking about what it means to be open to reporting and distributing the information, even if it's uncomfortable information. And honestly, if we didn't do that in the countries that we report in around the world, we wouldn't have the trust that we have right now. Everyone sees and understands that in those countries we are reporting not just the things that one group of people want us to report. We're reporting the things that exist, that are true, that are factual.
It's incredible. Thank you so much, Amanda. We were actually we prepared a final question. It was, as we continue to move on this 2024. Aside from that, you mentioned that, and this is really hopeful to see that despite the grim situation in media, people are coming more to your organization, you're increasing viewers. Is there any other hopeful development you see in general in terms of freedom of expression? Or is there something that a takeaway that we can take as audience to have hope of what's to come, as well as some perhaps trends that can tell us where the future lies on this fight of increasing freedom of expression?
Yeah, and I think it does go back to the fact that despite the fact that it's dangerous, despite the fact that it's hard, despite the fact that it's becoming technologically more difficult, you are still seeing that people are working to make this happen, that they're working hard to do it. And honestly, I don't yet see that we are in a worse situation than we were in World War II, when we were doing exactly the same kind of work. And I mean, during the Cold War, I don't feel like we are yet at that place. We see the trends going forward and we're aware of them and we're trying to work on them. But I think the fact that people are demanding it, that journalists are willing to risk their safety and their lives to do that, it's incredible that they're willing to do that, that people are willing to risk things in their own countries to reach this information. I think that all of you, I'm sure every single person on this call has had lots of exposure to lots of places around the world. But I think most of the people in the United States do not understand that however annoying and messy and difficult our own media structure is in the United States, it's completely different from the rest of the world. And I think I really hope that people remember to value this thing that we've had from the very beginning, this First Amendment, and that we're exporting it around the world, and people want it. Even if they're prevented from having it, they want it. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not going to be a Pollyanna and say that the situation is easy. It's hard. But the fact is, people still want it and they value it. So I think that's amazing.
Amanda, I hate to ask a follow-up to the final question, but I do think that that is an amazing takeaway for me, is that one, both we have reporters on the ground from their nations doing really risky work, but also we have citizens and countries risking their lives, risking their freedoms, whatever freedom they might have, in order to access the information. Those are two things that are really buoyant in our times and something we do not face here. So with those in mind, if out there are young journalists, since that is your background and you're working with journalists every day, what advice do you have for them in entering a media landscape?
Well, I would say that, again, I'm not a Pollyanna. It's hard. And the situation we have in the United States is actually more of an economic situation than others. So entering into a journalistic career at this stage is quite hard, because the number of opportunities for that to take place is difficult. I would say I'd do it anyway. Do it anyway, because it's really important, and make sure that you find a way to learn how to do it right, to learn how to do it in a way that the people around the world would have trust in you if they saw, read, heard what you were reporting, that they would understand and feel confident that you had given all the sides of an argument or all the factors in a thing a fair and thorough evaluation. I would say that if you do that, you will be doing something, I think, that will be good not just for yourself but for the whole world.
That was that was a moving end. Pedro, do you have any other questions?
I'm quite impressed, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to converse. And if I may, I just ask, one of the questions I had on my personal note is, in the future, when I have to perform research and in different positions, we, like students that are graduating and go into jobs, we have to kind of like get information to define things. When we're doing things for our career, do you think is the driving force, aside from passion and the ability to do things, do you think for you and in your organization, has it been the mission goal, or is there some other thing that you think that's guided you to take the decisions you've taken in your career and get all these accomplishments, like the Pulitzer Prize, having been appointed to this position? Like, what do you think has helped you in your career?
I'll go back to the thing. It's interesting. We cycle right back around. The thing I said right at the very beginning is that I believed all this stuff throughout my entire career, but it wasn't until I got to this place that I realized that I really do believe it. And when you're put in a position where you have to say, like, this is really serious, and you have to decide whether or not you really still believe it, that I do. And we find some really incredible people are coming to work for us, and I think it's all about the mission. I mean, people objectively have told me, as they're we're interviewing them for jobs here, I said, what do you want to come here for? And they say, because I just so respect the mission. And I think that's a wonderful thing to feel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, both of you. These were really, really good. Definitely hard questions, but thank you very much for asking them.
Amanda, thank you for the conversation. I thank you on behalf of the audience that is out there as well. And I also want to thank Mike and his team for putting together this conversation. And I'll throw it back to Mike.
Great. Thank you, Amanda, Layla, and Pedro, for such a wonderful conversation. So thorough, so enlightening. We also want to thank everybody who's listened in today. We look forward to continuing the conversation and invite everybody to check back in for more programming like this via either our website at ihouse.uchicago.edu or through our other partners at Berkeley and New York and One Shared World and the Chicago Center on Democracy. Wishing you all a great rest of your day, no matter where you happen to be. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.